as far as me going out and getting in a battle where with a bunch of MCs and it's just me, you know what I'm saying? I'm a marked man. So everybody knows everything about me, you know what I'm saying? So I don't really choose to do that. Sometimes at shows, though, I have pulled people up on stage and battled them.
As the mid-1990s rolled around, music was not in the healthiest of states. The wildfire that had been grunge had been extinguished by its own repetitive mediocrity, as the new bands of the day churned out sickeningly derivative music based on the structured blueprint of Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam, without adding anything new or even barely interesting to that established formula. The popular music charts were awash with a never-ending stream of god-awful dance ditties that numbed the listener's brain until all they could hear was the repetitive beat of the electronic bass drum. In addition to this atrocity, we had inflicted upon us the pointless meanderings of countless girl and boy bands, sadly devoid of any semblance of musical talent, and sporting the kind of saccharine lyrics that would make a hormonal teenager blush. Heavy metal was in an extreme state of flux, with the whole scene feeling a collective disappointment, thanks to the distinct averageness of the new Iron Maiden album, and the worrying new musical direction that the mighty Metallica had taken on their new record. Things were bleak, and it didn't look like matters were going to get any brighter in the near future. But as bad as these things were, nothing could compare to the trouble that rap and hip-hop was in. While dance music has always been inane and brainless, and in truth there have always been girl and boy bands of widely varying degrees of talent, rap and hip-hop have always been hardcore. The music and lyrics have always been equated to modern-day urban hymns, with the rappers standing up, standing out, and acting as the spokespeople for their generation, for the poor and disaffected youth of America. But now, for better or worse, a new breed of rappers was appearing. Only they no longer wanted to be known as rappers. They wanted to be known as hip-hop artists. Their beats were weak, and their lyrics were laughably pedestrian and deeply uninspiring. Rap had been diluted so as to make it almost unrecognisable from its original form. The unthinkable had happened. Hip-hop had gone pop. It was a desperately sad state of affairs. While the respected rappers of old continued in their own respective inimitable styles, they just weren't doing enough business or selling any records outside of their hardcore fan base to keep up with the young Turks who were clogging up the charts with their hip-hop. This caused many of them to call it a day and retire gracefully, deeply saddened by hip-hop's cruel demise. Where could rap go from here? How could hip-hop redeem itself? These were the questions that plagued the minds of every hardcore rapper and rap fan the world over. Of course, the rebirth started slowly and quietly. People were rapping freestyle at small venues, and tapes were being traded over a massive network of fans, a feat not achieved since the days of the San Francisco Bay Area thrash metal scene of the mid-80s. The ultimate irony was that the bland and inoffensive pop music that the likes of Will Smith had been putting out had actually forced hip-hop back to where it started, the underground. A new fledgling scene had sprung up without anyone noticing. Talented young rappers were everywhere, intent on bringing down the establishment, hungry for controversy, just as the scene's forefathers had been. Out of all these young wannabes, one rapper stood out. Hailing from the mean streets of Detroit, Michigan, and ready to take over the world, came the man they call Slim Shady.
A lot of people are going to relate to what I'm saying because whether white, black, whatever nationality you are, you know, there's a lot of poor people, there's a lot of lower class people in America that can feel where I'm coming from. You know what I mean? That's why a lot of things I say, a lot of people can relate to, like, oh, I've been there.
The remarkable tale of Eminem began in a rather unremarkable fashion in Kansas City, Missouri, in the year 1973. It all began with Debbie Nelson, a pretty 15-year-old girl who was also the singer for a popular local band. As is so often the case, she fell in love with one of her bandmates, Marshall Mathers Jr., and as soon as she was of legal age, they got married. On October the 17th, 1975, Debbie gave birth to her first child, a son who was named Marshall Bruce Mathers III. Debbie was ecstatic. Unfortunately, her husband wasn't so happy, and 6 months after the birth of his son, Marshall Mathers Jr. walked out of their lives forever. The young Marshall's upbringing was sadly far from idyllic. Everyone felt that Debbie was more than a little unstable. She'd have constant mood changes that just could not be predicted. One moment she would be affable, attentive and affectionate. The next she'd be sat quietly in a corner, withdrawn from the world. On occasion she could even jump in your face and scream bloody murder. As time went on, Marshall's mother would come to be suspected of suffering from a mental disorder called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This disorder made a parent believe that his or her perfectly fit and well child is ill. The parent would then force that child to undergo numerous unnecessary medical treatments. With that thought in mind, it is perhaps for the best that during his formative years, the young Marshall was often left with a veritable menagerie of relatives, while Debbie went off to do her own thing. As a result of this, Marshall became extremely close to his mother's little brother, Ronnie. To the young Marshall, Ronnie was more than his uncle or just another one of a whole host of distant relatives. He was his brother and his best friend, which made what happened next all the harder for both boys to handle. In 1980, when Marshall had reached 5 years of age, Debbie and her son relocated from Missouri to Warren in East Detroit, Michigan. Marshall was devastated. He missed Ronnie terribly and became visibly withdrawn. This upset Debbie, as Marshall had always been such a happy child. But the move to Detroit wasn't the only upset playing on Marshall's young mind. Unbeknownst to Debbie, every time Marshall left the house, he was terrorised by the neighbourhood bullies. He was constantly hunted down and beaten because he was small and couldn't defend himself, and also because of being white. But the problems that Marshall had to face at home are nothing compared to the unmitigated torment that he was forced to endure at school. Every day proves to be a new chapter of pain for Marshall, as he was put through a gamut of taunts and psychological abuse at every break period, every lunchtime, and on every walk home. The bullying that Marshall suffered was far more than petty name-calling. It was vicious. But more disturbing is the fact that the bullies were methodical and deliberate in the way in which they tormented him. They did everything they could to ensure that Marshall lived in terror, from the first bell of the school day to the last. Sadly, they succeeded in their goal more often than they failed. The abuse came to a tragic head when Marshall entered the 4th grade. It was during this period that Marshall was terrorised every day by one older student, who was, needless to say, a much feared bully. The beatings that this guy meted out were more violent than anything that Marshall had had to deal with in past instances of abuse he'd suffered. The thug would beat him anywhere and everywhere, be it in the toilet, the cloakroom, or even mere feet from Marshall's front door. Unfortunately, things were going to get a lot worse before they got better, and in the winter of 1983 things got noticeably more vicious. Marshall was faking illness in an attempt to stay away from the torment he was suffering at school. But while he occasionally managed to escape, he was almost always caught sooner or later. One day during recess, the bully cornered Marshall in the playground and proceeded to hand out the most harrowingly violent attack that the lad had ever endured. As the battered youngster collapsed unconscious to the floor, the bully carried on kicking him in the head. This continued until he was pulled off by a teacher who somehow hadn't realised what was happening until that moment. The attempts to revive the unconscious Marshall failed, and he was rushed to hospital where he lay in a coma for 10 days. The swelling on his brain was so severe that the doctors admitted to Debbie that he may not pull through. Eventually, when he woke up, he seemed unscarred both in body and mind, but he was now harbouring a hatred that would drive him on to success in later years. After Marshall's close brush with death, Debbie decided that they couldn't stay in Detroit any longer, and in the summer of 1984 they moved back home to Kansas City, Missouri, and back to Ronnie. The two boys were inseparable and spent all of their free time together. Marshall really looked up to his uncle. He was in awe of him and thought that he was a real badass, though Ronnie was never anything less than a stand-up guy whenever he and Marshall were together. Being as enamoured as he was with him, it's little wonder that Marshall started to take an interest in Ronnie's hobbies, and it turned out that he was a big fan of rap music. A talented rapper himself, he was quite happy to beatbox and make homemade rap tapes for Marshall, who loved them and listened to them constantly. But his real wake-up call came when, at the age of 9, Ronnie played him a song called Reckless by a Los Angeles rapper named Ice-T. It was then that he began to understand exactly what rap and hip-hop were all about.
You got like the East Coast and you got the West Coast. And the East Coast is predominantly known for like lyrics. And the West Coast is predominantly known for like gangster-ish, you know what I'm saying? So when you mix, like Detroit is kind of in between both of them, you know what I'm saying? So when you mix the two, you get something crazy.
From the early Delta blues of the American South to Chuck Berry in the 1950s, the Motown scene in the 60s and Jimi Hendrix, black Americans have reflected their cultural heritage and rhythms in their music. In 1979, a frenetic fusion of disco and beat poetry hit the charts. Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang became the first ever rap hit single. A new age had dawned. The music produced by the original innovators of rap such as Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, Curtis Blow and Dougie Fresh and the Get Fresh crew, became the clarion call for the disaffected youth of America, be they black or white. Though nowadays we may regard their music as old school and minimalist, you still cannot deny or underestimate the impact that they had on the whole hip-hop scene. Hot on the heels of these rappers came artists such as Run DMC and the Beastie Boys from the Def Jam record label. These bands regularly incorporated funk, disco, and in the latter's case even corrosive heavy metal guitar samples into their hip-hop blueprint. This helped the groups to achieve an extremely aggressive impact, especially evident on the Beasties' 1986 album License to Ill, which featured the frantic guitar soloing of Kerry King from Slayer on the now legendary song No Sleep Till Brooklyn. License to Ill went on to become the first ever rap album to reach number 1 in the charts. Hip-hop was well and truly up and running. Between the mid-1980s and the early 1990s, New York City was the home of hip-hop. LL Cool J, Rakim, Eric B, De La Soul, Salt-N-Pepa, Public Enemy, A Tribe Called Quest were just a few of the rap acts that held the hip-hop world in the palm of their hands. But as the 90s took off, a new breed of rapper emerged on the west coast of America. Since the mid-80s, Ice-T had been the sole West Coast artist getting any East Coast respect. But now his young West Coast protégés were about to grab the mic and step up to bat against the New York crew. This was the advent of gangster rap. Gangster rap was a harsh, violent hip-hop subgenre. Its lyrics preached the virtues of living on the wrong side of the law, of dealing drugs, and breaking out your gat and slaying a fool. Bands like NWA, Cypress Hill, Snoop Doggy Dogg, Booyah Tribe and of course Ice-T himself were the main exponents of West Coast gangster rap. But the East Coast took little time to catch them up. Notorious B.I.G., Tupac and Gravediggers all went to play for the East Coast team. A feud erupted and blood was shed. The gangsters of hip-hop were being slain, just the same as the brothers in Compton, South Central, Harlem, Brooklyn, or the Bronx. Snoop went to court on murder charges, and Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. were killed in drive-by shootings. Gangster rap was falling apart at the seams, with only Dr. Dre, Ice-T and Ice Cube still dominant forces in the hip-hop world. Puff Daddy, Jay-Z and Nas had watered hip-hop down in an attempt to make it more palatable for the masses, and hardcore hip-hop was in dire straits. Thankfully, there were people waiting in the wings ready to inject some blood and thunder back into the rap scene.
Tupac was definitely like the greatest songwriter that ever lived, you know. I really feel that. You know, Tupac was like, not necessarily my favorite MC, you know what I mean? I look at MCing as a little bit different aspect. Tupac just, you could feel his words, you could feel what he was saying, you could tell, you know what I mean? That's how I want the world to like perceive me. Whatever I say, I want you to know that I ain't saying it just to say it, I'm saying it because I mean it.
Upon his return to Missouri, the time Marshall spent with his Uncle Ronnie was the happiest of his life. His mother was in a stable condition, which was good news for the young Marshall's home life. But in 1987, after 3 years of blissful happiness, Debbie packed up house and moved with Marshall back to Detroit. This time the move was a permanent one, and he was left heartbroken by his separation from Ronnie. Once in Detroit, however, he began to recover from his depression. Though over the previous 3 years he'd become a hardcore rap fan, Marshall had never felt comfortable with the idea of rapping in Ronnie's presence. He felt incredibly self-conscious, not least because Ronnie was an extremely talented rapper who really had a knack for rhyming. It was now that Marshall turned the move to Detroit into something really positive. He began to rap seriously, making upbeat tapes and rhyming to them. Much to his own surprise, he was pretty good. His years of watching Ronnie like a hawk were starting to pay dividends. At the age of 13, Marshall began actually writing down lyrics for his raps. He started utilising the beatbox techniques that Ronnie imparted to him to record his own hip-hop tracks. As he continued practising, his rapping became faster and more lyrically focused. He was really getting a feel for the vocal rhythm patterns that all rappers have. It was at this point that Marshall took on his own rap alias, Eminem. The name Eminem came simply from his initials, M and M. He liked the name as it was still close to his own, though presented it in a completely new and different way. Following the adaptation of his new hip-hop moniker, Eminem started to make waves at the high school at which he'd enrolled. It turned out that battle rapping was a popular playground pastime, much to his delight. It involved going head-to-head with another rapper and trading off rhymes. The first to lose the flow or get tongue-tied loses the battle. But being in Detroit, that wasn't all they lost. As kids, these young rappers couldn't legally bet anywhere, so they took to gambling on the hip-hop face-offs. Due to the fact that he was vastly superior to the majority of his peers, Eminem won constantly, making a nice bit of money for himself in the process. In fact, he won so consistently that after a while no one could be persuaded to face him, as they knew that defeat would be inevitable. Eminem earned a great deal of respect in the playground, and for the first time he truly realised that being a rapper was definitely going to be a viable option for him, if he continued to practice and hone his rhyming skills. At 15 years of age, Eminem met the girl who would become his high school sweetheart, and eventually his wife, Kimberly Scott. It was also at this time that he formed his first rap group with school friends, under the banner of Basement Productions. Over the following 2 years, he skipped school constantly. Like most kids, he found it a total drag, especially as he felt his time could be better spent rapping. After all, he was going to become a famous rapper. What the hell did he care about chemistry, high school pep rallies or algebra? Eminem continued cutting class up until the age of 17, when he dropped out of school altogether, intent on pursuing his dream. He sent out tapes of his rapping and got asked along to a local radio station, where he started to perform regularly at their open mic nights. He was told that he was pretty good for a white guy. This backhanded compliment only served to fuel Eminem's fire, making him more intent on striving towards the successful realisation of his ambition. In the summer of 1992, Ronnie came to stay with Eminem in Detroit. Eminem was naturally ecstatic to have his uncle around and spent all his time in Ronnie's company. He realised that he had come a long way since moving from Missouri to Michigan and finally felt comfortable telling Ronnie about his dreams of being a rap star. Ronnie's response turned out to be a whole lot less positive than Eminem had expected. He told his nephew that he had given up rapping for good and that Eminem's dreams were just that, dreams. His words left Eminem deflated, but also instilled in him a determination to never lose his hope like Ronnie obviously had. Eminem was desperate for a break, and his prayers were answered in the winter of '92, when he was offered the opportunity to perform on stage at the biggest, most popular hip-hop club in Detroit. His excitement at the prospect was total, though his bubble was burst when he took to the stage. The crowd started booing the rapper, and continued to do so throughout the duration of his set. They steadfastly refused to give him a chance. But while they may have upset him that night, they also gave him the will and determination to return. The club's owner had been impressed by Eminem's resilience in the face of such open hostility, and offered him the chance to come back. He said yes immediately, and over the course of the following year kept doggedly plugging away, entering the rap competitions held at the club every weekend. The more appearances he put in, the more he seemed to win the crowd over. He was finally gaining the respect he deserved, and before long he was winning the rap competitions near enough every week. Based on his club performances, he was offered the chance to rap on WHYT, the biggest hip-hop radio station in the city of Detroit. This was a doubly exciting proposition, as numerous other rappers had gained record deals after their appearances on the show. Eminem was totally focused and ready to grasp the opportunity. But all his hard work came crashing down around him like a house of cards, when tragedy came calling for Marshall Mathers.
When I did my Infinite album in '96, when I had did that, I knew that, like, I had a way to put words together, but I wasn't exactly sure where to go with it. I just knew, like, how to put, like, big words together and just rhyme it, you know. I always had a good vocabulary, you know. I got something out of school.
On the 13th of December 1993, Eminem was hanging out at a friend's house when he received a phone call from his mother, Debbie. As he took the phone from his friend, he could hear his mother crying on the other end of the line. When he asked her what was wrong, she could only manage to reply with a fresh volley of sobs. Eventually, he managed to calm her down enough so that she could speak, but he soon wished he hadn't. Debbie blurted out the two most heartbreaking words that Eminem had ever heard. Ronnie's dead. The icy tentacle of fear squeezed Eminem's heart as he ran home to console his mother. Yet still, he couldn't believe it was true. When he got home, the horror was confirmed. He had killed himself. The shock that Eminem felt was absolute. While his mother seemed content to sob herself to sleep, he just couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. What could have depressed his uncle to such an extent that he'd take his own life rather than seek help? Eminem blamed himself. His rationale was that if Ronnie had called him first and talked things over, then he wouldn't have done what he did. It was a warped logic that only served to make the grieving Eminem feel more sorry for himself. He obviously wasn't at fault in any shape or form, but the desire to rationalise Ronnie's death led to a horrible feeling of guilt that weighed heavily on his shoulders. Eventually, Eminem's feelings of guilt gave way to one of emptiness and deep depression. He was inconsolable, and nothing that his mother nor his girlfriend Kim said could pull him out of the hole he'd dug for himself. For the first time since he was 13, Eminem stopped writing and rapping. He spent all his time in his room listening to Ronnie's rap tapes, playing them over and over again. It was almost as if he believed that Ronnie would come back if he heard his own voice rapping out a constant mantra. The depression continued for over a year, and in all that time he didn't pick up his writing pen once. But on the 15th of March 1995, he received a piece of news that was every bit as good as his mother's December's phone call had been bad. Kim sat him down and told him that she was pregnant, and that he was going to be a father. Kim gave birth to a bouncing baby girl on the 25th of December 1995. Eminem's happiness knew no bounds, and he and Kim agreed to call their daughter Hailey Jade. The birth of that daughter proved to be a real eye-opener for Eminem, and he made the decision to pull himself up by his bootlaces and start living life again. He was determined to be a good father to Hailey and provide for her in all the ways that his own father had never provided for him. Eminem came to realise that all he really wanted to do was rap, and that it was about time to get back to work. Before long, Eminem returned to rap with a renewed determination and fresh inspiration, and it didn't take long for him to create a huge buzz for himself on the underground rap scene. He was noticed by a small production company called FBT Productions. They approached Eminem and offered him the chance to record his debut album. It was an offer too good to refuse for the young rapper. As he came to record the album, Eminem was advised to pen radio-friendly songs. He duly obliged and produced a series of uplifting songs written about his daughter and his contented family life. Eminem's debut record, Infinite, was released in the autumn of 1996. Unfortunately, the record gained no airplay and made virtually no sales. Infinite was an unmitigated disaster. FBT dropped Eminem like a hot stone, leaving him in creative limbo. At this point, things went from bad to worse. Eminem, Kim and Hailey were evicted from their apartment, and with money troubles he couldn't even afford to buy nappies for his daughter. Kim left Eminem and took Hailey with her. She moved back home with her parents, and Eminem was denied access to Hailey, not even being allowed to go into the house to see her. These events sent Eminem down into a spiral of depression, and in December 1996 history repeated itself when Eminem made a serious suicide attempt. He survived the overdose, but as he recovered he felt unbridled rage coursing through his veins. Pouring all his fury and frustration back into his rapping, in January 1997, Slim Shady was born. Slim Shady was Eminem's evil alter ego and a plain statement of intent. The premise being that everyone has a dark side to their personality, and Slim Shady is the result of what happens if your dark side takes control of you. Under his new guise of Slim Shady, Eminem started to write new lyrics. These lyrics were dark, angry, and supremely antagonistic. They all seemed to target Eminem's past, specifically his childhood. Slim Shady's dark message was lapped up by the fans, and earned him a mention in Source's influential unsigned hype column. Later in the year, he won the 1997 Wake Up Show Freestyle Performer of the Year award. As a result, Eminem was invited to the biggest rap competition in the country, and on the 24th of October, Slim Shady made a big splash at Rap Sheet magazine's annual Rap Olympics. Eminem reached the final of the competition, but after 6 furious rounds he lost the battle. After his success in Los Angeles, Eminem released the Slim Shady EP, his first recording in the guise of Slim Shady. The disc was a roaring success and turned Eminem into an underground star. As a result, the rapper was invited to appear on MC Shabam Sadiq's 5-Star Generals single, and also on Kid Rock's Devil Without a Cause album. At the end of the year, Eminem released a well-received split 12-inch called Nuttin' to Do Scary Movies with fellow Detroit rapper Royce the 5'9". But little did Eminem know that a copy of the Slim Shady EP had fallen into the hands of one of the most influential men in hip-hop, the man straight out of Compton, Dr. Dre.